What do you do with commands in Scripture that are attributed to God and seem to condone sexual violence toward women? This is a tough topic to discuss, and some of what you'll hear in this video may be triggering or inappropriate for some viewers. So please be cautious when listening. I invited two Christian scholars on with different perspectives to discuss this issue. The first is Dr. Randal Rauser, author of the book Jesus Loves Canaanites, and the second is Dr. David Lamb, author of the book God Behaving Badly. The links to both books are in the description below. In this discussion, we'll focus on two passages from the book of Deuteronomy. One passage condones what Israelite soldiers may do with young women captured during war. The other passage concerns scenarios where a man commits sexual violence toward a woman, and it seems like there's a command for the woman to marry that man. The big question I want you to have in your mind as you listen to these two scholars discuss this is the following. Did God really command these things? All right, let's get started. Okay, so there are two passages that we want to look at today, and I'm going to read out one of them at a time, starting with Deuteronomy 21, verses 10 to 14. So I'm reading from the ESV. It says, "When you go out to war against your enemies, and the Lord your God gives them into your hand, and you take them captive, and among the captives a beautiful woman, and you desire to take her to be your wife, and you bring her home to your house, she shall shave her head and pare her nails, and she shall take off the clothes in which she was captured, and shall remain in your house, and lament her father and her mother a full month. After that you may go into her and be her husband, and she shall be your wife. But if you no longer delight in her, you shall let her go where she wants. But you shall not sell her for money, nor shall you treat her as a slave, since you have humiliated her." Okay, so that's the first passage we're going to look at today. And Dr. Lamb, I'm going to start with you because you're the Old Testament scholar here. How do you go about interpreting that passage?
First of all, I just want to say I love talking about the Bible. I've just met Jordan and Randall here, but I'm looking forward to having this hour or so to chat about this text. And I do have to say up front, this is a passage that, unfortunately, a lot of Christians are probably not very familiar with. And just the fact that we're spending some time talking about it, I think is a great thing. And Jordan, that you're arranging this. I know Randall's thought about this as well. So well done to the two of you guys for talking about this text, which I think a lot of people are going to say is highly problematic. The other thing, just a little caveat I need to say up front, I have never, again, the texts we're going to be talking about talk about sexual situations, sexual abuse, rape, possibly. And the Bible talks about these things. And I just have to say up front, I have never been raped. And I, as a white male in a position of power and privilege, this is not something I have to worry about. And I've never been in war. And so when I speak about these texts that talk about war brides, some people think war rape, I'm on one level, I'm not speaking from any kind of experience, and I feel a little bit uncomfortable. But the Bible talks about these, and so I teach the Bible, so I have to talk about it. And I actually have talked about these quite a bit. I called David a rapist in Christianity Today a couple of years ago. So anyway, preface, this is a hard text. Let's just say that up front. And there are a lot of things I'm looking forward to hearing Randall's perspective on this. I think we're probably not going to see exactly eye to eye here. I'll make a couple points. This is not the ideal. And if anybody says this is the ideal, that's not what the ideal of God in terms of men and women in marriage is: one man, one woman together forever. And Genesis 2, that's where the Bible starts. So this is a post-fall, I'm going to say a post-Genesis 3 patriarchal world that is being described. This is not an ideal situation, but it's a law meant to mitigate a really problematic scenario. Okay. The woman here is not a young girl. Hebrew has a word for young girl. It's na'ara. That word is not used. It's the word used here is isha, which woman is the best way to translate it. It's probably not young woman. It's a hypothetical situation. So we're not sure how old this person is, but the woman that is being described is of marriageable age, maybe 18 to 30. We don't know. It's hypothetical. The word that gets translated as desire or love, if you're not familiar with the text, the Israelite man desires this woman, is hashak. And some people think, well, that's like he's lusting after her because he wants to rape her or take advantage of her. That's not the connotations that the word has elsewhere in Scripture. The word does get used in a context of rape back in Genesis 34 because Shechem rapes Judah's daughter Dinah. But some people think, well, it sounds like it's a rape context, Hashak. But in Genesis 34, it's used to describe what Shechem's father approaches Jacob, Dinah's father, and says, hey, my son wants to marry your daughter because he loves her. He hashaks her. He is not saying, this father is not saying to this dad, hey, my son he's lusting after your daughter. He wants to rape her. Hashak has positive love connotations, as it does in the book of Deuteronomy. This word love, desire, hashak is used two other places in Deuteronomy, and both of those are describing God's relationship with his people. He hashaks them. He loves them. So the connotations are very positive in the book of Deuteronomy. It's not a kind of a lustful desiring to seize, take advantage of, but it's like how God loves his people. So again, this is problematic. What options did this young woman have in this situation? We don't know. But she could starve, which is probably what happened a lot in the ancient Near East. She could be raped, which again, tragically happens in war both today and back then, probably more then than today, be killed. She could become a prostitute. She could become a slave in Israel, which is often what happened for women in this situation. But the idea that she's going to return to her homeland and find a young surviving husband, I think is unlikely. That's probably the least likely scenario. I say elsewhere, I talk about that as Disney-esque in its naivete, maybe. But the fact that she could marry an Israelite who loves her like Yahweh loves his people, again, Hashak, that sounds like a pretty good option for her, better than a lot of the other ones. This is not ideal. So again, the thing that the takeaway I get here is this law is restricting the man and giving privileges to this woman. She's a wife, not a concubine, not a slave. She's allowed to lament. So this is not a war rape. Some people think of it as a war rape because it's 30 days later. I mean, war rapes happen on the battlefield or within 24 hours. So she waits a month. She's given time. 7 days may be pretty standard, but this potential husband has to wait 30 days. 30 days was how long Israel grieved for Aaron and Moses. They grieved for 30 days. So the fact that this foreign woman is given the same amount of time that Israel got to grieve Moses and Aaron, that sounds shocking to me. Now, I lost my mother-in-law a month ago. My wife and I will be grieving her loss for the rest of our lives. A month is not enough time, but it's pretty standard. In fact, it's generous in this context. And then the other thing I'd say is she is not allowed to divorce, or if she does, she can't sell her for money. So there's a number of ways that, again, I'm troubled by this law. It doesn't make sense to us today. But in that context, it made a lot of sense, and it was mainly advocating for the woman. So I'll stop there. I'd love to hear Randal's comments.
I tried point by point to jot down the main ideas. So if Randal doesn't touch on a certain point you made, I might ask Randal to follow up on that. But yeah, Randal, wherever you want to take that, go for it.
Yeah, I want to say it's great to be with you again, Jordan, and it's delight to be with you, David, and to get to know you a bit. We'll have somewhat different lenses, I think, when we come to these texts. David's coming primarily as a biblical scholar. I'm coming as a systematic theologian, but also as a workplace investigator who deals with things including sexual assault investigations.
Wow.
So I'm going to have a different lens when I come to these texts. So David said it's not rape because, and he talked about, well, the word used conveys love, that this individual, he's not looking to rape her, he's looking to love her. And the first thing I want to say at the outset is that I think we need to get a definition of sexual assault on the table, and it is unconnected with the mental intention as such of the alleged perpetrator. Whether he thought he loved the individual or not is not how you determine whether a sexual assault has occurred. To identify whether a sexual assault has occurred, one looks standardly for 3 different criteria. I'm in Canada, and in the Criminal Code of Canada, there are these 3 criteria. And if you look in the United States, there are state-based definitions for how one defines sexual assault rather than a national one. But the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, or RAIN, has a good discussion of sex consent laws in the United States. And really, the 3 same criteria are standard across most legislative frameworks in the United States. So the first one is you have to be able to consent in order for an event of sexual contact not to be rape or sexual assault. You have to be able to consent. So, for example, you can't be a legal minor, or, I mean, we should be careful here because there are ages of consent is not always the same as the age of legal maturity status. But whatever that age of consent is, you have to have met that age. But another very important criterion for the ability to consent is to recognize that power relationships that exist can override the ability to freely consent to sexual contact.
Sure.
For example, if you have a pastor or a counselor and then a congregant or a counselee, there is a power differential there that's intrinsic that undermines the counselee or congregant's ability to sexually consent to a sexual contact with the pastor. In the context that we're dealing with, here's a female, and I'm going to take issue with saying that we should just say this is a woman, as we've conventionally defined woman, having reached majority status, 18, 19 years old, could be younger, for sure. But to say that person can freely consent when they have undergone the trauma of potentially having their family killed, having been kidnapped and taken out of the only family they've ever known, now to freely consent to a sexual contact in a marital relationship with one of their captors, potentially one of the people who kidnapped them and or killed their family, I don't think you can even have consent in a circumstance like that. And to talk about, yeah, but you're given 30 days. I mean, I think that's just enormously problematic if we want to put that into our contemporary framework to say that in this kind of radical power differential, a female could be kidnapped, maybe have her family killed, and then freely consent to have sexual contact with the person who had killed her family and or kidnapped her 30 days later. Second, consent has to be enthusiastic. And third, it has to be ongoing. And the reason that you have those additional criteria in law is for the recognition of what is called tonic immobility. So when people undergo severe significant trauma and then they are introduced into a sexual situation, they can have through that trauma what is colloquially called a freeze response, where they will dissociate from the ongoing events. They could become compliant. In extreme cases, they could become unconscious or it could become completely immobilized. The key is, however, that they're not giving any resistance to what is happening. So you could have then a 15, 16-year-old girl who was kidnapped from her family, maybe saw some members of her family killed. 30 days later, she is now being asked, will you freely consent to marry this individual who says he loves you based upon having viewed you? Not, the text doesn't reference any developed relationship that they've gotten to know each other. It simply describes a visual favorability of the captor to captee. Then can she freely consent? Would she show tonic immobilization and would simply go along with whatever was happening? Very likely so. And so what we have here is a text that sets up conditions which would allow for the sexual assaulted people. So then I simply ask, if we're going to think about what is the kind of legal framework that we would expect to come from God, well, would God give a legislative framework that allows for the sexual assault of some of the most vulnerable members of the population? And I think it's pretty easy to think that one would have some pretty significant concerns with that and would have a high degree of skepticism over that. And to say this is not the ideal, I think what's frustrating about that language is that it equivocates, to my mind, between something that maybe in the circumstances was the very best thing versus something that we just understand to be morally wrong. And I think now, with our lens of understanding what sexual consent is, how trauma and tonic immobility can affect people, the importance of understanding power relationships, that we would recognize this kind of legislative framework is simply an unacceptable one that does not protect the most vulnerable members of the population. Finally, a couple more things. First of all, some people may think, oh, but you're being anachronistic, or you're reading contemporary understandings of X, Y, and Z back into the ancient Near East. We always do that. So the concept of genocide, for example, wasn't formulated in international law until 1948. That doesn't prevent us from going back throughout history and identifying historic events as genocide, thus meeting the definition we now accept of genocide. It's the same thing when it comes to sexual consent and rape. The current understanding we now have, including these criteria for understanding sexual consent, we can go back throughout history and identify specific instances that in the past may not have been viewed as rape or sexual assault, but which we would now understand, in fact, to constitute rape or sexual assault. I did have one other thing, but I think I'll leave it for now. So that's my initial concern with the text.
Randal, I appreciate your perspective here, and you've got familiarity with some things that I do not have familiarity with, so I appreciate that. One, I just commend you for your work that you're doing. Again, love to chat more about that. That sounds really important. And again, I wrote a book about non-ideal sexual behavior in the Bible, and where I talk about rape and incest and a lot of things, because the Bible talks about that, and the fact that you're dealing with that in a contemporary situation today. Wow, keep praying for you in that ministry. That sounds really important. And again, I appreciate hearing your perspectives on this text, which are pretty different from mine in terms of your own personal background. So I would say that I would encourage you to take a look at like some ancient Near Eastern laws that address this situation. I agree with you completely. We cannot divorce ourselves from our current context, and everything whenever we read scripture, we're going to be reading it in light of our own current context. But we also need to read it in light of its ancient context. And there's a book that I recommend, David Baker's Open Fists, Tight Fists, or Open Hands. He looks at ancient Near Eastern laws on a variety of subjects, particularly when it comes to wealth and poverty. And his work on these laws in Genesis, Deuteronomy 21 and 22 is within that context, ancient Israelites' laws were highly progressive. Now, again, we could still be troubled by them, but I think as we do our work in the ancient context, we realize that actually it made sense. And we don't know, again, we're talking about a hypothetical situation, right? This is not a real, if this happens, this is what but there actually is a real situation that is roughly parallel to this, that of Rahab. Rahab is pretty much the first war bride that it gets talked about in the text later. If you're not familiar with the story of Rahab, she shows up. Deuteronomy is the 5th book of the Bible. Joshua is the 6th book. And she's the first woman we meet in Joshua chapter 2. And she is a foreigner, and her city is conquered. Jericho is conquered. She becomes part of the Israelites, and we don't find out about it from the book of Joshua, but we find out about it from the book of Matthew, that she ends up marrying an Israelite. Now, we don't know what that was like. Was she traumatized? Certainly. Was her entire family killed? Well, not her entire family, because some of them were saved. But were many of her friends killed? Certainly. The city of Jericho was destroyed, traumatized without a doubt. But for one reason or other, and the text doesn't tell us, she decided as a foreigner who was captive that she wants to identify with God and God's people. And then she ends up in Jesus's genealogy in Matthew 1, and then the book of Hebrews praises her for her faith, and the book of James praises her for her works. So this woman, who is literally a captive war bride, decides that this was what I want. And so I think we always have to be looking at these hypothetical laws, and can we find some analogous situations? And I think Rahab provides us with one. And we say, well, clearly from Rahab's perspective, that was something that she wanted. So it's problematic, and I'll grab that. But yeah, so I have a question for Randal when we get to a stopping point, or I'd love to hear his thoughts.
Let Randal comment on what you just said, and then
Sure.
You can ask your question to Randal.
Okay, I certainly appreciate we ought to understand these texts in their ancient context, definitely. And I don't dispute that there is a relative progression over some other ancient Near Eastern laws, like the 30 days allowed to mourn. I would also say that doesn't change the fact that something which maybe in some respects is less bad than something else is not still itself bad, right? Or morally unacceptable. David also referenced, well, there's dealing with a hypothetical situation, but I don't think that's relevant. Whether it's hypothetical or actual, it's giving us a legal framework to deal with situations as they arise. And so we have to deal with the ethics and the wisdom or prudence of the framework that's been given. So you could say, well, there's a law that says, hypothetically, if you see migrants camping on your property, you can shoot and kill them. And to say, well, but that's hypothetical. We don't know that any migrants will ever camp on my property. That's beside the point. The point is you still judge this law dealing with hypotheticals on its own terms, including the ethics and wisdom or prudence of it. The one thing that concerns me here is that, so what I think David tries to do, and I think it's a noble enterprise, is to recognize, and he's clearly, I think, stated that there is some gap between the moral universe of the text and the moral universe of the 21st century reader. And as Christians, we should want to overcome or bridge that gap. And there are various ways you can do that. The concern I have sometimes is where we align ourselves to the moral world of the text as a means to overcome the gap. What that can do then is lead us to adopt positions that are themselves, in fact, immoral. So I think I have a real concern. I'm not saying David's doing this, but I have a concern and a caution for everyone when we come to a passage like Deuteronomy 21 to downplay how important consent is, to downplay how important it is to recognize power relationships, because we want to defend the text in a way that ends up harming vulnerable people in our own population. For example, the kinds of things I would deal with in my work, which might be a pastor that is accused of sexually assaulting or engaging in clergy sexual abuse of a congregant. And then one could say, because they're downplaying the importance of these power relationships and how they can undermine a person's ability to freely consent to sexual contact, because we've imbibed that from Deuteronomy 21, this now leads us to accept the pastor's telling of this narrative as consensual adultery rather than recognizing it for what it is, which is clergy sexual abuse. So I really worry that we have to be careful about some of these projects of trying to defend the text and align it in a way that's consistent with our 21st century moral intuitions and removes the cognitive dissonance, ends up leading to us adopting moral positions which I think are problematic, if not indefensible.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And that's always going to be the case when we're talking about the Bible. And you could choose silly things like dietary laws or clothes, the types of clothes you wear, or violence, or the violence in the Old Testament leads to the Crusades, or defending this law somehow could allow pastors who have been guilty of sexual abuse or even raping congregants tragically to feel like, well, the Bible thinks it's okay, or it's more of a gray thing. So I completely agree with you there. We've got to be really careful how we talk about this. Again, I mean, let me just ask you a question. Randal, what would you hope would happen for this woman who, it sounds like in your framework, she's not going to marry the Israelite because it's hard for you to imagine that happening and not be a sexually abusive power dynamic. What's going to happen to her? To me, I just feel this is, in that context, this is giving her a lot more power than she would have had in that context. But I think that's not your perspective. So I'd love to hear what should happen for this woman, that she is an unmarried woman that's been conquered by Israel.
So you keep saying woman. Today, we would say woman is someone who's age of majority status, depending on where one lives, 18, 19, 21 years old, something like that.
Well,
What is your basis?
Just the words the text use. Isha, woman.
Isha is female. I mean, it's not just woman.
There's a word for female. There's a word for female. But the primary.
Yeah, but are you saying it couldn't be a 16-year-old or a 17-year-old?
No, it could be a 16-year-old, could be a 17,
Okay.
Could be a 32-year-old, could be a 42-year-old.
Right. But it's more, I'm guessing it's more likely that a soldier's going to be attracted to a 17-year-old than to a 42-year-old. So
there's Sarah's out there. Sarah was 90 and so I agree with your point generally. Most men find younger women more attractive. So I'll grant that.
See, but like the caution I gave earlier, I think with respect, you're actually demonstrating the problem right here. Because you just said men find young women more attractive. A 17-year-old is not a woman. A 17-year-old is a child. A 16-year-old is a child. And
See,
I think that
that
when you keep using the English word woman, then it makes it more palatable than to recognize this could have been a 16-year-old who was kidnapped from her family or witnessed her parents killed.
and that is certainly a possibility. I think that's highly speculative. But if this passage is talking about 100 women that maybe could have been in this situation, it's very possible that a handful of them would be 14 or 15. But the text is using the word isha, which again, a woman of a marriageable age. So that's all I say here. Let me ask you
Okay.
another question
Right.
though. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, he actually didn't answer your first question.
Sure.
He picked
Yeah.
on the word woman. Your question was, what would you want to see happen to this
Yeah.
woman? Sorry to interject, but just to,
No.
so my viewers can follow along. Don't let me put words in your mouth, Dave, but it seems like your point in your initial comments was, this seems like it's one of the best options available to this woman because her other options would be to starve, to become a prostitute, to become a slave. So even though this isn't ideal, it seems like the best of a bad set of options. That sounds like what your point was, Dave, and if
Yeah.
I'm misrepresenting you, please feel free.
No.
But now it sounds like Dave is asking Randal, okay, Randal, given the options available to this woman, what should the law have been essentially like? What would you expect to see God command in this sort of circumstance, I guess?
Yeah. So to be clear, I wasn't trying to evade his question. I think that saying whether we're dealing with, as he now conceded, potentially 15 or 14-year-old is not an insignificant point to clarify. But
Yeah,
with
yeah, I didn't
respect,
mean to imply
yeah, yeah,
that.
yeah,
I'm glad you addressed the
I
woman
think
issue.
sorry,
I
yeah.
just
I
wanted to make sure the
conceded
first
the
question got
point.
answered.
I think it's unlikely because the word isha is used. It's conceivable. It's also conceivable she's 90. I mean, and looks like Sarah, but whatever. Yeah.
Okay. So with respect to well, what options are available to her here, I think so. What this really leads us, first of all, back to the prior question: why is she lamenting her father and mother? Was she kidnapped? Were her parents killed? And that brings us back to a bigger question: why are soldiers kidnapping girls from their families? Why are they killing civilians? These are just additional issues and problems. And to say, well, God could not have revealed himself in any other way than through laws that allowed for kidnapping children and killing their parents, I think just further pushes the question. So here as well, we today recognize it's wrong to target and kill non-combatants. We recognize it's wrong to kidnap children from their families. Everybody was in unanimity in 2014 in calling out Boko Haram in northern Nigeria when they were doing precisely the kinds of things that Deuteronomy 21:10-14 talks about. So if we're going to
No,
bring that critique of Boko Haram, then you're going to, just let me finish my sentence. If we're going to bring that critique to children being kidnapped from families in 2014, we should be able to bring it to the ancient Near East.
Okay. First of all, this is not Boko Haram here. There's a word in Hebrew for child. That word is not used. In ancient Israel, women would probably often marry in their teens. Okay. So in my country, and I know things are a little different in Canada. I can't speak to a lot of experience about Canadian laws, but you can't vote till you're 18. You can't drink till you're 21. Well, back in ancient Israel, young boys could go to war at age 13, 14, 15, and women would probably often get married earlier than they do today. So things were pretty different. And that's actually true in a lot of parts of the world today. So the idea of, yeah, some of these laws were different. Now, I'm not saying that's a good thing. I think it's good to have laws about statutory rape, but I'm just saying, I'm not granting that the word is not young girl. It's not young woman. It's a woman. So,
I mean, you're right that in the ancient Near East, things were different. People married younger. They marry younger in rural Afghanistan today. But do you take the position that we shouldn't be fighting the fact that there are child brides in rural Afghanistan because in rural Afghanistan this is commonly practiced?
I think that's a problem. I'm gonna ask my question again. What should have been done for this young woman or this 30-year-old, 20, whatever. Pick. I'm saying 18 to 30. You're pushing for 14, 15, but whatever. This, let's call her an Isha. What should be done for this Isha?
So the question is, could God have developed a legislative framework in which it would have protected the captor, her ability to consent sexually, by not putting her in a situation where she would have to consent or be asked to consent to marriage with one of her captors or one of the soldiers who killed her family? And I think it's pretty easy to conceive of an omnipotent being being able to come up with a legislative framework which would not put her in that situation, that would have no attention to her consent. Because I think sexual consent matters. And I know you do too.
I completely agree. Sexual consent matters.
Yeah.
I don't think this text
Yeah.
is removing her sexual consent. Obviously you do, and that's fine. And we can just agree to disagree here.
Well, okay. Are you disputing the first point that a person who's been captured there's a radical power imbalance introduced there?
There is a
so
power
that they would
imbalance.
not be able to freely consent?
There is a power imbalance, but I still think, what happened with Rahab? Again, she's a captive.
Well, we're not talking about Rahab. We're talking
that Rahab is the example that we don't see examples of this, except I think with Rahab, and that seemed to work out pretty positively. Now we don't know all the details. We're speculating what happens between Joshua chapter 6 and then Matthew 1, where we find out that Rahab is in Jesus's genealogy. We don't know.
Are you saying that Rahab, the instance of Rahab, provides a counterexample to the first criterion of consent?
I think Rahab provides a counterexample. Feels too strong, but it's a positive example of how this could work out. We don't see negative examples of it just because it's, again, I'm going to say it, it's a hypothetical law that we just don't see. We don't see, okay, in the book of Joshua, well, we got to go back to Deuteronomy 21. And what does this look like to implement this law? We never see that. The closest thing I think we see is with Rahab.
I have to decide at this point because we're at 35 minutes and I want to make sure we comment on that second passage. Is it okay if because a lot of this I think will continue. So I think it's okay to shift unless somebody's like really set on having more comments. Okay, go ahead and
Jordan, one thing is you had said there were some things that I didn't address with David's opening statement. I want to make sure there wasn't anything still outstanding there that you want to talk about.
Right. Let's see. So there are points that were made. However, from looking at it, I'm trying to remain as neutral as possible. I don't know that you addressing those points will leave an opening in your case. You know what I mean? Like Dave said things about this law is actually restricting the man, but it's giving privileges to the woman. I think that was the main thing. So unless you want to comment on that.
I'd love to talk about Deuteronomy 22. And I feel like I've learned some things from Jordan and been able to express my thoughts about it as well. So I'm happy to shift to Deuteronomy 22.
Okay. Let me go ahead and read Deuteronomy 22, verses 22 to 29. Okay, it says, if a man is found lying with the wife of another man, both of them shall die, the man who lay with the woman and the woman. So you shall purge the evil from Israel. If there is a betrothed virgin, and a man meets her in the city and lies with her, then you shall bring them both out to the gate of that city, and you shall stone them to death with stones. The young woman, because she did not cry for help, though she was in the city, and the man, because he violated his neighbor's wife. So you shall purge the evil from your midst. But if in the open country a man meets a young woman who is betrothed, and the man seizes her and lies with her, then only the man who lay with her shall die. But you shall do nothing to the young woman. She has committed no offense punishable by death. For this case is like that of a man attacking and murdering his neighbor, because he met her in the open country, and though the betrothed young woman cried for help, there was no one to rescue her. If a man meets a virgin who is not betrothed, and seizes her and lies with her, and they are found, then the man who lay with her shall give the father of the young woman 50 shekels of silver, and she shall be his wife, because he has violated her. he may not divorce her all of his days. Okay, I'll stop there. Dave started with the last comments. So, Randal, if it's okay with you, will you offer your thoughts on this text and Dave can comment on what you say?
Sure. For the sake of time, I'll just focus on verses 23 and 24. Okay, so we have the betrothed virgin. She meets a man. He lies with her, and that's all the information we're given. Then they're caught, and together they should be stoned to death. And the reason for the woman being stoned to death is because she did not cry for help. Now, this appears to contrast with the next passage, where if there's nobody around, presumably to hear, then she's not punished for not having called out because nobody would have been able to hear, I take it. But within the city, within a settled community, there would have been people around to hear her. So if she does not cry for help, I take it that this is viewed as complicity on her part, and that warrants her being killed. Couple things. So first of all, in terms of capital punishment, and particularly capital punishment through stoning, which is being pelted to death with rocks, right? So there was a film that came out around 15 years ago called The Stoning of Soraya M. And it depicts graphically a modern stoning which occurred in the early 1980s in rural Iran. And I would simply ask anyone who can stomach it to watch the last 25 minutes of that film that depicts what it is actually like to be stoned to death. It's an inexplicably horrific and brutal way to die. So the first thing you want to ask is about God's perfect law here. To have such a cruel and unusual form of punishment, which we would today unequivocally recognize to be a war crime, unequivocally. And yet that is what is prescribed here. The second thing, the death penalty is given to her because she did not cry out. This is precisely where I want to come back and really emphasize the importance of our understanding today of trauma responses, including tonic immobility and dissociation. So when a female or when anybody is in an extreme traumatic situation, one response, as I said, is tonic immobility, where the person may lose the ability to speak, where they may even lose the ability to move, where they may completely dissociate from the act, they may become unconscious. These are not signs of consent. These are signs of a person undergoing extreme trauma. And what we have here potentially is a scenario where a female has, and it could be a woman we would consider today an adult, could be a teenager, could be a 16-year-old. She has been traumatized potentially by a man who raped her. And yet because she did not call out, she is considered to be a consensual partner and should herself be executed by stoning. And I think we can recognize that this is a pretty vicious legislative framework, and it does not secure the protection of some of the most vulnerable members of society.
I appreciate your perspective there. And I appreciate your understanding of kind of, again, that I'm going to miss the terminology, but I appreciate, how she would potentially freeze in this situation. I think most commentators talk about this 23, 24, or 25 as more consensual adultery. Now, again, does this hypothetical woman consent? We don't know. I mean, they meet in the city and they sleep together. And maybe my lens on the text of trying to defend God or God's law is causing me to have blinders here. But I do think that, well, I agree with you that stoning is a heinous crime, a heinous punishment. Yes, we see very few examples of stoning in Scripture, and perhaps the most famous example where the issue of stoning comes up is where Jesus comes along and says, well, to the woman caught in adultery, where's the guy, right? Where's the man caught in adultery? But he of you who is without sin, let him cast the first stone. So just the fact that Jesus's take on this is, and this is what I would say, this was a law that is saying the wages of sin are death. That's what Paul says later on, that there are consequences to sinful behavior. We just don't see a lot of examples of stoning. So somehow, somewhere, people just thought, this is making a point. And we don't actually see many examples of stoning. You see the guy that I think it's Numbers 15, the stick gathering man gets stoned. And then obviously Stephen in Acts, but that's a very different situation. So yes, it's problematic. We don't see a lot of examples of this happening. Yeah. So if I can I move down into Deuteronomy 22, the other sections? So again, there's these four scenarios, and most commentators say, well, the first one seems to be consensual adultery. The second one seems to be consensual adultery in a city. Did this woman consent? Well, we just have a few words to describe all of what's going on. And from my perspective, the implication is that this was a consensual encounter, in contrast to what happens in the third scenario, which is more clearly the rape of its betrothed woman in the country. The word there for the man that seizes her, it's shazak, grabs. It's a very a violent word. He seizes her, and to me, this is shockingly progressive. How do we know that he raped her? Well, we just believe the woman, right? Which doesn't happen in the US today. I don't know, maybe that happens in Canada. But based on this woman's testimony, this victimized woman, he dies and she survives. Which, again, to me, that's like, well, that doesn't happen in the US military. It doesn't happen on college campuses. We just believe the woman. She's given the benefit of the doubt, which to me it sounds shockingly progressive. And certainly that was not the ancient Near East. Again, we could check out Baker's book to talk about that. So I would say a shockingly progressive scenario where the woman is just believed and the man is not, which tells me that God does not condone rape. Okay, that's the takeaway from 25, 26, and 27 to me. 28 and 29, now that's more problematic because it sure seems like she has been, this young woman who has been probably raped is being told to marry her rapist. Well, I see a number of differences between scenario 4 and scenario 3, and I could talk about those, but the biggest one is the word that is translated. The ESV, I think, as you read it, translates both the word in 25, shazak, as seizes, and the word tapas here as seizes. But tapas is not as violent of a word. In fact, it is used in a rape context in Genesis 39. Who tapas is somebody? It's Mrs. Potiphar grabs Joseph. And talk about a power dynamic. Mrs. Potiphar has all the power. Joseph's a slave. It's an attempted power seduction, maybe power rape. But now maybe it's because as a young, strong man, he resists this grab, but it's a different word. Whereas shazak in 25 is used in rape contexts elsewhere. And I could if you want, I could list those. So I see a number of differences in scenario 4. Again, I would probably call it rape, but it's not as violent as the rape in 25 to 27. And some people think it's seduction. I think it's maybe stronger than that, but some people could call it seduction or maybe a power rape or maybe a statutory rape, something like that. I don't know. The fourth scenario doesn't seem to be as violent as the third. And I think, well, I'll shut up. I have another illustration from scripture that I could share
I might know the illustration that you're going to say, and I think it would be relevant for Randal to respond to. It's
okay.
One you gave in your book.
Sure. So again, we read this and go, what? She's commanded to marry her rapist. What's up with that? Does not make any sense to us today. A law that would do this, and I think Randal and I are going to be in agreement on this one, a law that would say you should marry a rapist is just heinous. Yet in that context, when David's daughter, Tamar, was raped by her half-brother, Amnon, and it was clearly non-consensual. But afterwards, Tamar says, "You can't kick me out." And this is the biggest shocking line to me. It would be more evil for you to kick me out than the evil you already did by raping me. This is the perspective of this woman that lived 3,000 years ago in that context. She knew that she needed to marry her rapist. Does not make any sense to me at all, or any people today, I would think. But to Tamar, that this fourth scenario made sense. And tragically, Amnon ignored her, and then she was destitute, but because she was the daughter of a king, she probably did okay. So those are my comments.
Go ahead, Randal.
So I would be inclined to critique any culture in which the best option for a rape victim is to marry her rapist. Now, the reason that I mentioned verses 23 to 24 is precisely because I think this flies under the radar of most people. And I think based on what David said, I think it flies under the radar of most commentators who view this as consensual, because that's to read into the text, right? It doesn't say anything about the mental state of the female. It's just assumed that she's consenting. The text seems to maybe assume that she's consenting, but that's precisely the problem, as I'm pointing out, is that she may very well have had a tonic immobility response. And we cannot overstate how horrifying it is that a person who is sexually assaulted and had a tonic immobility response to the trauma would then be pelted to death with rocks because they didn't call out. So David himself said he doesn't know. He said, I don't know. There, she said, does she consent? I don't know. He said. So I agree. You can't know because that description is too general to know the mental state of the female in this act of sexual contact. And yet the legislative framework that's provided here doesn't get onto that issue. So it's just not addressing it. So it would allow for people who had that trauma response to be killed. And I think, again, that's precisely the kind of moral problematic with the text that I want to highlight. One last thing I'll just say is David described stoning as heinous. I agree. Stoning, capital punishment by stoning is heinous. Now, I would just say this, that when I call something heinous, that's a moral judgment. To say something is heinous is to say it's immoral to do. One ought not do things that are heinous. If David agrees with me, then he would say God ought not have prescribed death by stoning. If he doesn't, then I think he's equivocating on what people standardly mean when they use the word heinous.
Randal, can I ask you a question? Why would you believe in a God that would make laws like this?
So my understanding about the Bible begins with Jesus, and Jesus becomes my grid. I mean, I wrote a whole book on that, Jesus Loves Canaanites. And and this is really the underlying theological assumption is you're reading these texts, it seems that God did literally command all these things. Of course, not every Christian reads these texts in that way. I don't read these texts in that way. I don't believe that God literally commanded these laws as they're written here. I believe these laws reflect the understanding of ancient peoples about who God was and what God expected from them. But that doesn't mean that God literally commanded these things. And to take your view over my view is not in the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed or any of the other central creeds of Christianity. One of the benefits of taking my reading and approach of these texts over yours is it frees one up from the kind of cognitive dissonance that, in my view, is besetting aspects of your position. Now, of course, there are other places where your view is just fine, but I think there are points like dealing with a text that allows for females who undergo tonic immobility to be killed by stoning. That's a pretty significant problem, and one that I don't think we should downplay. And the last thing I'll just say is, again, my concern is the degree to which, or one concern is the degree to which these attempts to rationalize these texts and to eliminate the gap between our understanding of moral issues today versus the ancient world ends up forcing us or bringing us to accept things that we really know to be wrong, to think otherwise, whether it's downplaying sexual consent or saying, well, maybe death by stoning is okay and not heinous after all.
Yeah, I would.
Can I
Go ahead.
just throw one thing in? Because based on what you said, I know I've read his book, and so I know in other contexts what he says. Dave might get the impression that you would think that these texts, these laws, are not inspired. Dave, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but would you have gotten the impression from Randal what he just said that you would think?
I was assuming that
God
I
didn't
hadn't
command
heard
these
that
things, but
assumption yet,
nevertheless.
but yeah. And so, I mean, there's part of me that's really attracted to your perspective, Randal, because all those problematic texts, they just go away. I've had really long conversations with my friend Eric Seibert about these things. It sounds like you guys are, at least on some of these things, in a similar place. And again, I said to Eric, man, I would love to conclude what you do because the problems just all go away. My problem, though, is like, how do you decide? And his whatever Christocentric hermeneutic, which sounds like is comparable to yours, we've all got our hermeneutics. And you might say, well, my hermeneutic is to justify God's behavior. You have a different hermeneutic, which I understand. It's not my own, but I would say there's hyperbole in the text. There's literal and figurative. And I think a lot of Christians get caught up in overviewing. Well, we view literal text figuratively and figurative text literally, and that gets us into all sorts of problems. And the other thing I would just say is I'm completely in your camp when it comes to, we have got to talk about these texts, and we've not need to, you may over problematize. I mean, I got to write a book called God Behaving Badly. So I have no problems problematizing the God of the Bible and struggling with it, as do you and Eric Seibert. And I have a lot of other friends that kind of maybe are similar to where you are on these issues. So we need to not be afraid to problematize the text. For me, I'm going to try to make sense of them, not quite like Paul Copan does, but he and I are maybe in a more similar place than you and I are. Maybe I'm in the middle, but I think I just need to say the Bible talks about sexual abuse and rape a lot. And I talk about sexual abuse and rape a lot. And I've talked about it in a lot of situations. And like I said, I called David a rapist in Christianity Today, and I got a lot of pushback for that. I wrote that 2 years ago, 2 years before Me Too in 2015. So I talk about sexual abuse because the Bible talks about sexual abuse. The Bible's not afraid to talk about these issues. And the church, I think, unfortunately is. I appreciate your perspective, Randal. I appreciate you making people like me try to maybe feel a little more uncomfortable than we might want to be. But the church needs to talk about this. And I appreciate you talking about it. You and I are going to come up to some different conclusions about what we decide. But I appreciate your perspectives here.
I want to respect your all's time. I wish we could extend the conversation, but I totally understand. Randal, if you want to offer any concluding thoughts, go ahead and we'll wrap it up.
Sure. So I'm glad, Jordan, you asked about my own views, which you would know or have some familiarity with for sure. So yeah, I would accept plenary inspiration, and I would even accept a concept of inerrancy, qua divine authorial intent. The question is, what does God intend with a particular passage? So I actually come from a background of English. I did an English degree 30 years ago. And for me, it's you don't tinker with texts that are produced by authors. I give examples in one of my books of James Joyce, that there are later editors that try to go on and correct the quote-unquote errors in Ulysses. And in fact, those quote-unquote errors were put there by Joyce for a reason. And the challenge for the reader is not to correct with an edited text, but to figure out how do we read the text properly in light of the so-called errors. And I would have a similar view of Scripture, that when there are passages that do not align with some of our most fundamental moral convictions, then the proper response is not necessarily to sacrifice our moral intuitions. I'm not saying that you do, but I'm just saying that shouldn't be our response. Our response should be rather through a process of reflective equilibrium to come back to the text and read it through a Christological lens, very much like you referenced Eric Seibert doing, who I do know and would agree with broadly on these issues. I like how you concluded, and I think that we need to continue to have dialogue on these issues. Yeah. And one thing I like to hammer on is that no Christian should have this be an unnecessary crisis of faith, where they believe, in order for me to keep being a Christian, I've got to sacrifice some of my most fundamental moral convictions on a particular issue. And so that's one thing I do like to emphasize, and I'm respectful and grateful for the way that you respectfully and very articulately engaged and defended your position today. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
You too. Thank you. Thank you, Randal. Yeah, I appreciate your thoughts, and I learned a lot.
Unfortunately, these are not the only passages in the Old Testament that seem to condone violence. There are also texts where God appears to command genocide. If you're interested in hearing Dr. Rauser's perspective on those texts, then click right here.